Hey y'all, this is Joel Cunningham, editor of the Barnes & Noble Science Fiction and Fantasy Blog, and if you can't tell by my ridiculous glasses, it's 2017. But this should probably not be news to you anyway. If you've been following the blog for the past couple weeks, we've been talking about the books that are coming out in 2017. We've had a ton of lists go up. We had 96 books that sci-fi and fantasy editors can't wait for you to read. We've had debuts we're excited about. We've had sequels we're excited about. So here I'm going to tell you about the books that I personally am excited about because even though we talk about all those books, I actually don't read all of those books. But there are some that I make sure I do read, and I'm going to tell you 10 of them today. Number 10 is The Stars Are Legion by Cameron Hurley, which is coming out from Saga Press in February. And the only reason this one is number 10 is because I'm cheating a little bit, because I've actually read it already. And I think the hardcover version is going to have a quote from my review that I sent the editor, I'm hoping. But this is a really awesome book. Cameron Hurley likes to call it Lesbians in Space, but this is a space opera with no men in it. All the characters are women. It takes place on a giant organic world ship, which is kind of alive and kind of a spaceship. There's crazy politics and really compelling characters and a strong message of feminism, which is not surprising to you if you've read Cameron Hurley. She's known for her essay collection, The Geek Feminist Revolution. So if you like science fiction at all, Cameron Hurley is the future of the genre, and you should definitely read this book. Number 9 is Autonomous by Annalee Newitz. It's coming in September from Tor Books. You might know Annalee from the science fiction and technology blog IO9, which she co-founded with Charlie Jane Anders. Last year, Charlie Jane had her debut science fiction fantasy novel, All the Birds in the Sky, which I loved. This year, Annalee is coming out with hers. I don't know much about it at this point. There's no cover, and there's not really even a blurb about what it's about, except for the fact that it involves artificial intelligence, pharmaceutical piracy, a bunch of chase sequences, and probably some really interesting tech and politics. So I'm really looking forward to finding out what a novel from Annalee Newitz looks like. Number 8 is Barberie Station, a debut novel by R.E. Stearns, coming in December from Saga Press. This is one we did a cover reveal for a few months ago, and I've been really excited about it ever since because the blurb I got from the editor was lesbian, women of color, pirates in space, space opera for fans of Anne Leckie and Star Wars. So all things I like, all things that sound fascinating. It's supposed to be a really adventurous and forward-thinking science fiction space opera twist, and Saga Press always does something interesting with their books, so I'm excited to find out what that looks like here. Number 7 is the first sequel we have on the list, and it hasn't been officially announced yet, so I'm hoping that it actually comes out. But this is Sorcerer Royal by Zen Cho. This is the sequel to a book that came out in 2015 called Sorcerer to the Crown, which was a sort of Jane Austen twist on the fantasy novel about the first black Sorcerer Royal, who's sort of a governmental sorcerer who works for the British government, and he has to deal with racism and other issues while doing his job as the lead sorcerer for England. And he has a sort of sidekick in the first book that turns into a romance, a young woman who's also a woman of color who has magical abilities, which is something that is frowned upon for women. And so they go through a lot of adventures in the first book. They wind up in a pretty happy place, but since there's a sequel, probably things aren't going to go super well at that point. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens to those characters in the second book. So I'm hoping that comes out this fall. Number 6 is another debut. It is called The Prey of the Gods. It's by Nikki Drayden, and it's coming this summer from Harper Voyager. This is a book that, one, has an awesome cover with a robot and a little black girl standing next to the robot, which is already eye-catching, but it is set in near-future South Africa and involves, obviously, robots. From my understanding, they're being kept sort of as pets, and then they begin to become self-aware, which is one of my favorite tropes in science fiction. But this book also brings in some fantasy because there's a deposed demigoddess who's sort of trying to come back into power. There's a little girl who has amazing abilities that begin to grow over the course of the book. and I believe there's also a drug that allows people to unlock their own hidden talents. So it's kind of melding together science fiction, fantasy, near future, cyberpunk elements, a bunch of cool stuff mixed together in a debut that sounds really exciting. Number 5 on the list is probably a given, but I have to mention it here. It is A Conjuring of Light by V.E. Schwab, the third book in her Shades of Magic series. This series is about a universe where there's 4 Londons that exist in parallel. One of them has magic, one of them is sort of boring like ours, one of them is a really nasty place where magic has kind of gone wrong, and another one is just full of death. So that's the one you don't want to go to. But at the end of the last book, the one character who can travel between these Londons was kind of in a bad place. So he is relying on his friend, and possibly more, a woman who also has magical powers, to save him. So I'm looking forward to seeing how this whole mess wraps up in A Conjuring of Light, which is out in February. Number 4 is another book that hasn't officially been announced yet, but I'm crossing my fingers that it comes out. This is a new novel in Anne Leckie's Ancillary series. There was Ancillary Justice, Ancillary Mercy, and Ancillary Sword. Those 3 books completed a trilogy that deals with AI coming to awareness and giant spaceships that have their own sense of free will and a lot of complicated politics and interesting aliens. Probably my favorite science fiction series of the last decade. She's writing another book that's in the same universe but won't necessarily involve the same characters. It's kind of a question mark what it's going to be about, but it is due sometime this fall based on what the publisher said when they signed up the books, so I'm hoping it comes out because I really desperately want to read it. Number 3 is New York 2140 by Kim Stanley Robinson, and luckily I won't have to wait very long to read it because I already have an advanced copy, and this is coming out in March from Orbit Books. And as you can see by the cover, it's set in about a century hence in New York, by which time half of Manhattan is underwater. Don't know how Brooklyn's looking, so I'm not sure how the apartment I live in is doing. But it deals with the economy and the politics and just the day-to-day life of living in a flooded New York in the year 2140. And I've already read the first 20 pages. It starts off very well. Kim Stanley Robinson's last 2 books have numbered among my favorite books of their respective years, so I'm hoping this one keeps up that streak. Number 2 is another sequel. It's the follow-up to this book, 9 Fox Gambit by Yoon Ha Lee. The next one is called the Raven Stratagem. This book broke my brain when I read it. It's probably the most complicated space opera book I've read in quite some time. I couldn't tell you what's going on in any of the action sequences, but they were really still awesome to read. And there's really compelling main characters. The lead is a woman who was put in control of basically a no-win situation, freeing the space station from some rebels that were on board and protesting, let's say, not ideal living conditions by the government that's in power. In order to defeat this rebellion, she had to download a tyrannical dictator military commander into her head. He turned out to be not quite the despot she was expecting, but a really complicated guy. So we'll find out what happens with those 2 characters in the follow-up to 9 Fox Gambit, which was on our list of the best books of 2016. And number 1 on our list, that is my sad attempt to do a drum roll, is the follow-up to the 5th season and The Obelisk Gate, N.K. Jemisin's Hugo Award-winning science fiction / epic fantasy trilogy about a world that is undergoing a climactic apocalyptic event. There are people who have the power to control stone with magic, and let's say they are not well liked by the rest of society because they are blamed for these apocalyptic events. And by this point in the trilogy, there are a lot of balls in the air. Things are not going well for some characters, and they're going even worse for others, and the world is definitely on a downward spiral. So I'm really looking forward to finding out what happens to these characters and seeing if any of them come out of it alive in The Stone Sky, which is coming out in August from Orbit Books and is my most anticipated science fiction or fantasy book of the year. I don't know if your list matches mine, but I'd love to know, so please let me know in the comments. Follow us on Twitter at BNSciFi and keep reading the blog for more recommendations for what books you should be reading in 2017. Thanks a lot.